Well, thank you to Dr. Liu for the introduction and to all of you for coming, especially the people who are coming a second time. I appreciate that. The title I gave this lecture is Pluralism and Monism Between Metaphysics and Social Process. And the reason I titled it that, I think, will become clear later, but I won't start with explaining the title, but we'll get there later. Last lecture, we talked about philosophical anthropology and how philosophical anthropology told us that human beings are born deficient, was the word that Arnold Galen used. You could say they are born indeterminate. They're born without really knowing what world they're supposed to live in and how they're supposed to live in it. They don't know what they need to survive, and they don't know how to get it. The point was, the argument was that animals were born with all of those things in the form of instincts and patterned ways of dealing with the world, but human beings were born relatively either open, as Max Shaler put it, or deficient, as Galen put it. And I argued last time that values are crucial for humanity because they're what helps human beings make a world for themselves. They're what helps human beings know what is important to them, what is desirable, what it is good to want, what they should try to achieve, and also what things are not valuable, what they should try to avoid or not put their time into, and that it was values that help these human beings who are born relatively empty to avoid both having too few desires about the world, because they don't have instincts to tell them what to want, and also to avoid having too many desires, so that they would be going in too many directions at once, because in fact they can desire almost anything if they're presented with it. Okay, so values are crucial to humanity. That's where that argument got us. But when the scientific materialist worldview became dominant in the second half of the 19th century, it had been growing since the Enlightenment, but really became the dominant worldview. There's a lot of good historical work on how materialism became the fundamental worldview in Germany in particular, which was maybe the leading place in the world, or one of them for science at that time. Anyway, when the scientific materialist worldview became dominant, it chased values out of the world. It said, what is there in the world? Well, there's matter and there's motion. They're the forces that move matter around. But something called values isn't really in the world. We talked about that argument last time, but that left philosophers and social scientists who might think that values are critical for human beings to try to figure out where values are. And there's been confusion about this ever since. Some people think values are just inside of people. They're subjective. We make something valuable by valuing it, right? So if I value eating pork, then I will make pork valuable. If I don't value eating pork, but I value eating vegetable food, I'll make that valuable. But that's a matter of something that's inside of me, not inside of pigs or cattle or something like that. Or are they objective? Are they somehow out there in that real material world that the philosophers had sort of chased them out of, but had the philosophers maybe missed something about how values could be in the world? And the great French founder of sociology, who Dr. Liu was talking to you about, Emile Durkheim, to use my basically American pronunciation of his name, he took this second path. He said values really are out there in the world. They're not just subjective, but they're in the world in a special sense. They're objective in a special sense that's different from the way, let's say, rocks or walls are in the world. So I want to go over his argument a little bit because it turned out to be absolutely fundamental for how social sciences have addressed the problem of values. So Durkheim was trying to explain how groups of people who live together or who regularly have to work together come to share values? How is it that they come to share values? If values were only subjective, he argued, each person would have their own unique set of values. And it would be very hard then for them to cooperate. Social life, in fact, would be, in a phrase I'm guessing you all recognize, it would be a war of all against all to determine whose values were going to define what it's important to do in any given situation. If values were only subjective, we would always have to struggle in every interaction over whose values were going to dominate what we were going to do together. Okay? But Durkheim felt that, in fact, social life really wasn't a war of all against all. He had a brilliant, I guess I won't go into it here, but if people want to ask in questions, he had a brilliant critique of the social contract tradition, in particular of Hobbes, showing that, that you don't begin with a war of all against all and have society by contract, because you can't have a contract unless you already have a society. But if people are interested in that, we can talk about that. But anyway, it was important to him that social life was in fact a war of all against all, which must mean that there are some shared values, that when people come together to interact, often they share the same values. Now, the easiest way for people to share values is if values are somehow objective parts of the world, which means that each individual can discover the same values for themselves. Do you follow? Does that make sense? And so Durkheim set out to find a way, even in the face of the scientific materialist worldview, to argue that values are an objective part of the world. To do this, he had to say that values are objective in a special sense, maybe not the way the natural scientists thought of the objective world. And the way he made this argument is by saying that values are kinds of what he calls collective representations. That's a real term of art in Durkheim. You could call them shared representations if you want, but he called them collective representations. And collective representations, and this is kind of the core moment in this argument, collective representations for Durkheim are ideas about the world that we as individuals do not make up, but that come to us from the society in which we live. And we know we don't make them up as individuals, Durkheim says, because we feel we have no choice about the shape of them. We have no choice individually about what they're like. So, to take a simple example that works for the case at hand, if you want to attend a lecture, say at Fudan University, you have to understand that a lecture is somebody talking and a bunch of other people sitting and listening, right? You don't make this concept up. If you did try to make up your own concept of lecture, say, and come here with a musical instrument and start playing your musical instrument loudly while the lecturer was speaking, other people, and this is another term that Durkheim means, and it's central to Durkheim's thought, you would be sanctioned, which basically means punished. These punishments can be very light ones, like people looking at you. I don't know, there must be a way to do this in China. The sort of American way to do it is to kind of look at you like that. Or people would say, hey, you have to stop. People would move away from you. These are all, Durkheim says, punishments that make it that you have to conform to the collective representation of what a lecture is. If all those little sanctions didn't work, then maybe security would be called or you'd be removed from the lecture, which seemed to be threatening yesterday, but today we don't seem to have their presence. We had some visitors yesterday. Okay, so for Durkheim, the point is that the concept of lecture is a collective representation in your social world. You know what it is, you know how you're supposed to act, you don't have a sense that you make it up, and you don't have a sense that you could change it just by yourself, just because you one day felt like you wanted lectures to be done a different way. To take another collective representation, just checking to make sure I'm right, and I think I am, you're all dressed relatively alike today. Look around the room. My guess is none of you called each other before the lecture and said, well, what should we wear? You're all dressed in a way that you have a collective representation that suggests this is the appropriate way to dress for a day at the university. And if you dressed too formally, people would sanction you. They'd give you those looks, you'd hear them whispering, you would know that you had done something wrong. And in the same way, if you dressed too informally, then the same thing would happen, okay? And just like the nature of what a lecture is, the collective representation of how you should dress to come to a day at the university isn't something you make up. In some sense, it's coercive. You may not feel the coercion if you have no desire to do otherwise, but it is coercive in that if you don't follow that collective representation, the people around you will sanction you. They will make you uncomfortable. They will make you know that you have somehow not done what the collective representation sets out to do. So in a sense, collective representations have a kind of force. It's a force that's backed up by social relations that causes or that insists that people act in terms of its demands, or else face the consequences. So values for Durkheim are special kinds of collective representations, okay? Not all collective representations are values, but values are special kinds of collective representations because values are shared representations not just of the right or appropriate way to do things, but also of the desirable things to do. We talked about values as being based on what's desirable and not just desired last time. So for Durkheim, values are collective representations about what's desirable. So the next question then becomes, how do some collective representations get to be values, get to be collective representations of the desirable in this way? And Durkheim's key answer to this question is in his work about ritual, and more generally about shared collective activity. That is one of his other most famous arguments. Durkheim argues that when people come together to do things collectively, and he's particularly thinking of religious ritual, but he was also thinking of the French Revolution, and when you teach this stuff today, you can think about sporting events, you can think about all kinds of collective activities. When people come together to do things collectively, Durkheim says, and you can check this on your own life experience, they lose themselves, as we say in English, in a spirit of what he called in French, and this isn't very familiar in English, but its unfamiliarity, I think, also made it famous, called collective effervescence. Effervescence means kind of bubbling. You know, so it's like when you have a carbon, you know, like a soda with bubbles in it, that's a form of effervescence. So Durkheim says people are kind of bubbling together and that you lose yourself in this kind of energy of togetherness. And he says that this experience of effervescence makes people feel that they're more than they usually are when they're not involved in these collective activities. It makes them feel more powerful or more virtuous than they usually feel. It makes them feel that they've entered a kind of heightened moral state. You might know the feeling from concerts or parties or political rallies, sporting events, even really good conversations. There's a famous sociologist named Randall Collins, who's getting pretty old now, but is roughly contemporary, who argues that even really good conversations, even with a small group of people, can have this kind of can create this experience of collective effervescence, okay? So, Durkheim goes from this idea that when we experience this kind of collective effervescence, this collective unity, that makes us, that feels very powerful, it makes us feel better than our everyday selves. When that happens, we also feel like the representations that are connected, the collective representations that are connected with that experience are more desirable, are more virtuous, are better than our other collective representation. And these collective representations that play a role in our coming together and having these effervescent experiences, he says, these are the ones that become our values. They're the collective representations we find more desirable in others, precisely because they connect with these strong experiences, these experiences of being better or more powerful than we usually are in our everyday lives. So, knowing what we know about the Arotman from the last lecture, if anybody wasn't here last time, the Arotman are a very, very small language group of 400 people living very remotely in the western highlands of the island of Papua New Guinea, which is off the coast of Australia. It's an island that belongs half to Indonesia and half is an independent nation of Papua New Guinea. And Arotman think pigs are just the most valuable thing, one of the two most valuable things in their worlds. It won't surprise you that most collective rituals in Arotman involve pigs, and that any important collective event you celebrate, like a marriage or a death or two groups making an alliance, a political alliance, will involve pigs. In a way that I'm not going to have time to talk to you about, the Arotman became converted to Christianity in the late 1970s without having a missionary live there. It's an interesting story, but a long one, and we don't need it today. But they like their Christianity to be very, very free of any kind of traditional connections. So when I was doing my fieldwork, they built a new church. And the leaders said to everybody, tomorrow morning we're going to celebrate the opening of this new church. Please don't anybody kill a pig to celebrate this church, because that's not what we do as Christians. We don't kill pigs for that reason. So we all get up in the morning, and sure enough, somebody has killed a pig and put the blood on the door of the church, because in Arotman, really, really important collective moments involve pigs, and that's part of how pigs get that very central value that they have. I'm also guessing that for many of you, I mean, I don't completely know how this works in China, but a lot of the most important celebrations, collective effervescent moments in your lives had to do with academic achievement, with graduations, with award ceremonies, with admissions to various educational institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And Durkheim would say it's the connection of those things with those collective experiences that makes them seem so objectively valuable. Okay? So on Durkheim's account, values, like all of what he calls collective representations, or he also sometimes calls social facts, things that are facts because they're socially true, okay, are objective parts of the world as far as subjects are concerned. That is, you and me as individual subjects encounter these collective representations pretty much, or very much, as objective parts of our world. We know that we don't make them up, like I said, okay? We usually feel that we don't even choose them. They just feel part of how the world is. How you're supposed to dress to come to a lecture is just part of how the world is. It's nothing you decide, right? It's just out there in your world. Arotmen just know pigs are good. There are, in fact, a few Arotmen, I think maybe 3, who don't like to actually eat pigs. And that's okay. People think it's a little strange, but it's okay. But that doesn't mean they don't think pigs are very, very important, or that they would ever dream of making a marriage ceremony or a death ceremony or something without pigs, right? So you don't choose them. They are just there in your world, the same way probably you all know that educational achievement just is valuable. That you could have different feelings about whether you want it for yourself or not, but you know that it's valuable in your world. And finally, like all collective representations, if you ignore the values of those that you share your social life with, you will somehow be sanctioned. You'll somehow be punished. Okay, you will find adhering to these values coercive when it's not desirable. The same way you might like to walk through that wall, but no matter how much you want to do it, no matter how hard you concentrate on doing it, you won't be able to walk through that wall. Same way a Eurotman person will not be able to get through life not thinking pigs are very, very, very important. And for Durkheim, this makes them part of people's objective worlds, because his definition of subjective is you don't get to make it up, you don't get to choose it, and you are punished somehow. Your life doesn't go well if you ignore them. So now we have a model of values as part of the objective world. Now granted, on Durkheim's account, they're part of the world because human beings live in societies and share a collective life that is culturally organized. They're not real parts of the world in the sense that we think rocks are real, because they would still be here even if we all died off. But still very real in terms of how people experience them. And in this sense, Durkheim has somewhat redefined objectivity, keeping the part that says as individuals we don't get to make up the objective world just any way we choose, but not the part that says real things have to exist even if there are no people around at all. Some philosophers have moved toward this position. I guess John McDowell is the most famous one, by saying that values are like secondary qualities. Without humans, they wouldn't be perceived. But when humans perceive them, they really are perceiving something that's there in the worlds that humans live in. I'm probably taking some liberties with the notion of secondary qualities here, but that's the closest philosophical position I can find to this idea. Okay, so much of the reason I've gone into some detail about Durkheim, besides just thinking he's really brilliant and interesting, is that much of the best anthropological work on values comes out of the Durkheimian tradition. And it goes on to ask a question beyond whether, well, can we consider values objective, to also ask, if values really are in some sense out there in our shared worlds, how are they structured in relation to one another in that shared world? What is the relationship between values to each other in the shared world? You'll remember that I said last time, if you're here, that a value is always related to other values. There's no value that exists alone, because values always hierarchize things. So the minute you say something is very desirable, you're saying something is less desirable, and something is not desirable, et cetera, et cetera. So values are always in relation to other values. How do they relate to each other? That's the question I want to ask in the rest of what I have to say today. Now, as it happens, there is a philosophical discussion about the structure of the relations between values that I want to draw on, but I also want to modify it to develop an answer to the question of how value relations are organized in various societies, in various cultural systems. Okay, and this is the philosophical discussion that really is, I think, most prominent in political philosophy about value monism and value pluralism. So let me introduce you to these two positions here. Value monism holds that among values that are part of any social formation, there's always a paramount or highest value. Sometimes in the philosophical literature, this gets called a super value that is above all other values. It's more valuable than all other values. And the argument is that this super value is going to rank all the other values in a society in relation to each other by how much their realization contributes to realizing, or at least not hindering the realization of, the highest value. I realize that's complicated, but you're going to have a value that's most valued, and all the other values are going to find their own rank in relation to how much they contribute to being able to realize that super value, or at least don't block the realization of it. Probably the example that I've seen most often used of a super value in a specific philosophical argument is the claim that utilitarianism has a super value of happiness, right? If you've all encountered Utilitarianism, its value is the greatest happiness or the greatest good for the greatest number. It's saying happiness is the very highest value, and you're going to rank any other value you might pursue by how much it's also going to contribute to the happiness of the greatest number. Neoliberalism, as it's understood at least in the UK and England now, has a super value of market freedom. So every other value is ranked by how much it helps realize that or it hinders realizing that. Okay? The important point about monism, for what I want to say the rest of today, is that in a monist society, it will always be clear which value is highest in the ideology as a whole, and the ranks of all the other values will also be clear. And this would mean that there'd never really be any legitimate conflicts between values. In any given situation, one should know what context you're acting in and what the highest value is that applies in that context, and thus one should know which value you should try to realize. There shouldn't be any question about that. There shouldn't be any pull from other values. You might, and this is important for being kind of psychologically and socially realistic about this, you might struggle with yourself because you don't want to do what you do know is desirable or valuable in the situation at hand. You really may want to sleep during a lecture, right? Even I could, you know? But that's something you have to deal with in and of yourself. And in fact, you feel it as a conflict precisely because you know sleeping is not the highest value in this context. You know what the highest value is. So you might struggle with yourself whether you're going to realize the highest value. But in a monist organization of values, there should never be a question of what the highest value that applies is. Okay? Those who criticize value monism often take an opposed position, which is known as value pluralism. So let me talk a little bit about value pluralism. In contrast to monism, pluralism holds that the values that exist in the world, and by extension those that exist in any ideology or culture, are bound to conflict with one another, and that it will not always be possible to tell which one is more important or highly ranked of the two. In fact, you can never find a super value that ranks all the values perfectly beneath it. Okay? And the value pluralists say you can recognize this because you know there are situations in which to realize one value that you rank very highly, you'll have to give up realizing another value that you also rank just as highly. You recognize these kind of conflicts, the value pluralists say, when your values pull you in different directions, and when even after you choose to maximize or realize a value that you care about a lot, you feel regret about the value you haven't been able to realize. There's a line of argument in analytic philosophy that says that if you can feel rational regret over not doing something, that means you live in a pluralist situation. Like, if you could either come to this lecture or go to the library and write your paper that's due tomorrow, and you choose one, but whichever one you choose, you regret the one you didn't choose, that means you live in a pluralist. If that regret is rational, if you're not just crazy, you know, if you say, well, I regret not hurting myself in some way, then that's probably not a rational regret. But okay, so other examples that of the kind value pluralists like to give of this, in this sense, where you have two or more values that are kind of equally ranked and in conflict with each other because you can't realize both of them as once, is when you maybe give up trying to be a full-time artist to take a good job in a bank. This is something that a lot of young people who want to be artists, at least in the UK, feel. You want to maximize the value of economic success, but your regret indicates that you're not really sure that beauty isn't just as highly ranked in your world as the value of generating wealth for yourself. You You have to decide between those two because you can't do both of them together unless you're very, very lucky on the artist side. But you can't avoid feeling regret for the one that you don't choose. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin was probably the greatest exponent of value pluralism in 20th century philosophy. And he calls the choice between conflicting values, we talked about this in the answer to a question yesterday, he called them tragic choices. And they're tragic precisely because you're choosing between two good things. It's not tragic if you choose to do something that's clearly better than something else. It's tragic when you choose to do one good thing and then can't do the other good thing, even though it remains good. So he wanted to get at this sense of the tragedy that value pluralism presents people with tragic experiences. Not every experience they have will be tragic, but in a value pluralist world, there will be choices that are tragic in this way. Another great proponent of this position is the great sociologist Max Weber. He's also somebody people have heard of here? Yeah. But he is German, so maybe his name was just translated as Weber or whatever. Weber argued, and this is a pretty interesting argument, but I don't need to make the whole argument for this, but he says that what makes a society modern is that, but I don't think he's right about that. I don't think he's right that it makes society modern, but he says that societies are organized into what he calls different value spheres. A sphere, in this sense, kind of means an area. I don't know that sphere is actually the best. Even English speakers don't love this metaphor. Somebody I don't know if this is well known, but somebody yesterday mentioned, but I think maybe it was at lunch. What? Bourdieu's notion of fields. Is that notion familiar at all? Call them different social domains. That's what anthropologists used to call. They're different areas of society that are organized by different values. Weber himself lists 6 such spheres that he's observing in German society in the late 19th, early 20th century. He says there's a religious sphere, an economic sphere, a political sphere, an aesthetic sphere, aesthetic we tend to use more often now, an erotic sphere, and an intellectual sphere. We're definitely in the intellectual sphere now, right? So the intellectual values are organizing what we're doing, okay, which is, part of how this is going. But each sphere, Weber said, is going to be organized by its own main value. And it's these values that define particular spheres or domains of life that most conflict with each other. Such that, say, the market value of making a profit tends not to honor aesthetic values of producing beauty, or even erotic values of maximizing pleasure unless those pleasures can be sold, right? So each sphere is organized by a value that asks you to treat it as the highest value when you're in that sphere, but the values themselves of the different spheres conflict with each other, such that if you're busy acting in one sphere, you can't be acting in the other. If instead of taking very careful notes about what I'm saying, you were drawing a beautiful portrait in here, you might be realizing the value of the aesthetic sphere, but you then couldn't be realizing the value of the intellectual sphere, okay? Part of why Weber kind of says the spheres are all greedy for people's attention. They conflict with each other, and each one of them would like to monopolize your energy, would like to be your super value, okay? And he says that because he says that to hold the value is to want the valued thing to exist, and to exist in its fullest form or to the greatest extent possible. So each sphere kind of pushes you to realize the value it's organized around and then disregard those of other spheres, okay? In a more monist picture of value relations, like the kind we talked about first, the struggles between spheres would be resolved in the sense that the higher ranked values would organize the higher ranked spheres and would limit, in a very clear way, how much attention you should give to the lower ranked ones. So that no matter how much those lower ranked ones demand all of your attention, they're not likely to get it. So for instance, at least in the United States and England, artists who work in the aesthetic sphere, which in England and America is a lower ranked sphere than the market sphere, always feel like they lack material support, and they often have to compromise and take jobs outside of the aesthetic sphere that are more central to the economic sphere in order to survive, right? Because it's clear which one is higher and which one is lower. And even if their own choice is for a lower value sphere, they've got to give some attention to the demands of the higher one. But in Weber's pluralist picture, each person does have to juggle the demands of all of these spheres. In a pluralist world, all of these spheres make some kind of claim. And since there's no clear hierarchy in a truly pluralist situation telling you which one to prioritize, you just have to choose one of them, Weber says, and then live with your regrets. One of Weber's sort of famous ideas was that the job of a human being is to choose a value and stick to it and thereby become what he called a personality. Right? I think that to him is the opposite of what you are as a baby, this empty, deficient being. You have chosen a value. But you do have to choose it because it's not clear which one you should take. So famously, he summarizes his position. There's a very famous quote from Weber: "The various value spheres of the world stand in irreconcilable conflict with each other." Or another way he puts this is that conflicting values are like warring gods, where no god ever wins. And he's thinking of sort of classical, Greek mythology, where the gods fight their wars and human beings just get pushed around. We are kind of caught between these titanic battles between values. The only way we can make any stable position for ourselves is by choosing and sticking to our choice of which values we think are going to be more important. So I hope I've conveyed in this opening discussion of monism and pluralism, even though I haven't argued for it yet, that monists and pluralists don't just present two very different pictures of how values are organized in relation to each other, they also present two very different ways, two very different views of what human life is like. And in particular, I'm going to argue two different views of what human ethical life is like. Okay? For monists, value choices in every situation should ideally be clear. If you're thinking correctly, if you're perceiving the world directly, you will determine which value is most highly ranked in the situation you're in, and then you will realize that one. There won't be any agony over tragic choices between one value and another, because you will always know which one is higher. And that will always be the right thing to do. For pluralists, human life is not just a struggle to live up to one's clearly laid out ideals, but rather a struggle to choose ideals when caught between often equally strong pushes and pulls caused by conflicting equally valuable values. That is, in a pluralist situation, it's not so easy to know what the right thing is to do. There may be more than one right thing to do. So living in a pluralist world might have a greater sense of drama, and maybe even something like freedom that is more than just the freedom either to choose to do what's most valuable or to choose to fail at that, but rather Weber's freedom to sort of choose what is actually most important to yourself and then organize your life around that value. But it's also true that it's probably much harder to feel successful in the struggle to live by one's values in a pluralist world than it is in a monist world. It's easier to feel like you've done what's right or good or beautiful in a monist model than in the pluralist. Because in the pluralist one, you're always failing in regard to one value or another, no matter how much of some other value you realize. These are these tragic choices, right? So you're here listening to this lecture, but you are not developing your skills as an artist, nor are you making money right? So, directly. So, okay, so life in a pluralist world doesn't always have the satisfactions that come with feeling that one has made clearly correct decisions. But life in a monist society can really feel this way. Let me give you a nice example I read recently. I just haven't read it recently, of what it's like to be caught between two strong values without knowing which one is most important. And this comes from the work of an anthropologist who I think she's German, and in fact I don't know her personally. Her name is Sigrid, who studies young urban professionals in the West African country of Botswana. And Botswana, as you may know or may not, really had an extremely intense version of the AIDS crisis in the 1990s, maybe the most extreme in Africa. And that means there was also, since the 1990s, in Botswana, a very strong public education push for people to value taking responsibility for their own health, and in part to do this by practicing safe sex, which in this case means using condoms. These professionals accept this value of public and personal health. So they know that's important, and that pushes them to want to have safe sex. But they also find themselves drawn by an older traditional value that stresses having children to grow your extended family, which is also a very strong value. But from the point of view of that value, not having children is seen as selfish. It's disvalued. Okay? And so that pushes for having unprotected sexual relations. And the result is that young urban professionals in Botswana tend to go back and forth between acting on both these values. The AIDS crisis has been hard to tame, and they all feel they lose out on one value whenever they realize the other. So that's just a real-world example of people caught in a pluralist situation where they think two things are very good. It's very good to have as many children as you can. It's also very good to practice safe sex, but you can't do both of those things at once. And so they're caught in this kind of pluralist, tragic trap. How should we then, okay, so to this point, I've laid out the how I would read the philosophical debate between value pluralists and value monalists. But how should we as anthropologists approach this debate? One thing I should point out is that for a lot of philosophers, the questions of whether values are organized in a monist or pluralist way is a metaphysical issue. So for Isaiah Berlin, and this is very important to him about his argument, it's a fact about the world that there are equally good conflicting values that exist. It's not just a fact about his society. He thinks the way humans are and the way the world is, there really are equally good values that conflict. So freedom and security is one he will bring up, equality versus liberty. I mean, he comes from sort of the Western liberal tradition, so his big examples are of those kind, but he just thinks that's a true fact about the way the world is, given who people are, given what the world is. There are also value monists. Probably the most famous one was a legal philosopher named Ronald Dworkin, who died a few years ago, a British legal philosopher who spent a lot of his life teaching, his later life teaching in the US. He's a well-known monist who says that no, actually, if you understand the really good values that exist in the world, you will know that they can all be organized hierarchically such that they never conflict. And he spent a lot of his career trying to develop definitions of liberty as a value and equality as a value such that they could go together. Okay? But again, he thinks that's a fact about how values are. If we perceive them correctly, if we really know what the values are in this metaphysical sense, they could all work harmoniously together. So these are how the philosophers approach these questions, but I want to suggest that these metaphysical questions are not ones that social scientists are going to be able to answer. We wouldn't be sophisticated in the kind of arguments we would need, and they're not our questions exactly. But what we can do is explore empirically whether real ideologies or cultures around the world are monist or pluralist in their organization of values. We can ask what's going on in actual societies as regards to the pluralist or monist organization of values. This question isn't settled yet because there hasn't been enough work done exactly from this point of view. But I would suggest that we start with the hypothesis that all cultures or ideologies are marked by tendencies that push them in both holist and pluralist directions, and that actual social life consists in part of struggles between these two orientations. Struggles between, do we want to be a more monist kind of society, or do we want to be a more pluralist one? To show how this might, and so as anthropologists we can study different societies for the distinctive mixes of holism and monism they display and ask how they move in one or the other direction. Rather than asking what's true for all time and all places about values, do they really have a monist organization or a pluralist one? We can say, well, what is the mix we see in actually existing societies? To show how this might work, I'm going to look at one complex case that also has the advantage of exploring how this kind of analysis can inform debates in the anthropology of ethics, about ethical experience, and that intervenes in what is actually a very well-known debate in the anthropology of religion, and particularly the anthropology of Islam. And this has to do with the lives of Egyptian people who are involved in Salafi Islamic movements. Okay? These are sort of fundamentalist Islamic movements. And the best known anthropological works about these two movements are written by two people who are actually married to each other, although the first one, Saba Mahmoud, has passed away now, and also Charles Hirschkin. Both of them worked in Cairo, Egypt, and presented the Muslims they studied as very monist. For them, piety is a value that is on top of all other values. All other values are beneath it, and people follow this hierarchy very strictly. They follow it as much of the time as they can. So Charles Hirschkin's, actually, his fieldwork was with people listening to cassette sermons in taxi cabs. So even when they're in taxi cabs, they ask the taxi driver to play sermons so that they can turn the taxi drive into a place to realize their value of religious piety, of religious devotion, okay? As what I just said a few minutes earlier suggests, both Saba Mahmoud and Charles Hirschkin describe people with a strong sense of purpose. These very pietistic Muslims have a very strong sense of purpose, and they have very little doubt about what is most important for them to do. Their only worry is that they'll fall short of doing what they know they should. And a good deal of their lives is devoted to study and ritual practices aimed at preventing themselves from falling short in this way. That is, they have no question of what their highest value is. They just worry about having the inner qualities they need to focus on that value all the time, even when they're in a taxi, even when they're, okay. So Saba Mahmoud in particular writes a book called The Politics of Piety that becomes extremely influential, and Hirschkin's book is also quite influential. And then along comes another anthropologist named Shmuley Shilka, who's also studied fundamentalist Muslims, although not in Cairo, but in a smaller Egyptian city, okay? But he questions, let's say, the monist picture that Mahmoud and Hirschkin present, because he shows that the young men that he studies are not monist in this way. Okay? Along with their value of piety, they also have, from Egypt's socialist past and also from various media, they have values of worldly success and of romantic love, of finding the kind of romantic love that compete with those of piety. Moreover, from their surrounding social structure, they hold values about family loyalty, about social connectedness, and about marrying according to your family's wishes, not your own, that conflict with each other and also conflict with piety. So they've got a whole bunch of values that are really in conflict with each other. They don't have a strong sense that one is on top and should tell them the rank of all the others. And Schilke provides a really interesting study detailing how these young men move in and out of trying to realize each of these values at different times. For example, in Ramadan, the important Muslim holiday, they focus really intensely on piety. But as soon as that's over, they go on to working on other of the values they have, okay? But they do have trouble making all of these values work together, and so they have a lot of tragic regret about their lives. And one way Schilke shows you their regrets is that a lot of them want to migrate from their small city in Egypt. They want to leave Egypt altogether. Partially that's because they want to realize one of their values, that of worldly success, but also because they want to work to find a place where they feel like they're facing less tragic conflicts than they do at home, where the pluralism weighs less heavy on them. So as pluralists, these people Schilke is studying live with a much more unsettled sense of how it's best to live. They face tragic value conflicts that don't have any easy resolution. Now, Schilke really stresses this because he's writing in criticism of Mahmoud and Hirschkind. He wants to say they paint an overly monist picture. But it's also true that Schilke does admit that in this world that these young Egyptian men live in, okay, they do feel that Salafi Islam, the young men themselves feel that Salafi Islam does offer a monist picture of the world. When they're attracted to Salafism, it is because they feel it would allow them to settle their value conflicts, their pluralist value conflicts, by putting piety as their highest value. And they kind of sense that if they do stay in Egypt, that would be the one position from which they could lead lives that they call happiness and full of hope, and not marked by tragic value choices. So in some sense, Schilke does admit that Islam is pushing for a kind of monism here, and that the people he works with recognize this. But they live in a world that's pluralist to the extent that they're not really ready to, as it were, heed the call of the value of piety. Okay, so Salafism is a force for monism in Egypt, just not a wholly, Schilke admits that, but it's just not a wholly successful one in the setting that Schilke studies, which empirically is moved much more into the direction of pluralism. Okay, so Schilke gives us an interesting example of the kinds of cultural pressures that can push a society toward one or the other end of what we might want to end up seeing as a monist and pluralist continuum. Not focus only on purely monist situations or purely pluralist ones, but see them as on some kind of continuum. So this reading of Schilke and his critique of Mahmoud and Hirschkind, which as I said is very well known in the Anthropology of Ethics, it's one of the sort of set pieces you study in your first course, et cetera, this way of seeing this dispute is one of the kinds of analysis we could do when looking at objective values and how they're structured as an empirical problem. In the next lecture, I'm going to go on to somewhat modify our understanding of monism in light of in light of the claim that monism and pluralism are often in tension, and then discuss a range of contemporary, it's going to be the most anthropological of these lectures, a range of contemporary ethnographers of anthropological studies where very different kinds of potential high values seem to produce societies that are able to reproduce themselves, that are viable societies, and that allow us to begin to ask questions about, well, how many kinds of values are there that could successfully organize social life? But we'll get there next time. So thanks. I'm happy to take questions.